Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. I have the distinct honor of kicking off this program today. I'm replacing our CEO at Thunderbird, Sanjeev Kagram, who has been very busy in Dubai in this last couple of weeks, setting up a new innovation center for Thunderbird School of Global Management. So Sanjeev, please get well soon. Thunderbird is on the move, and as a Global Chamber founder and CEO, I'm very proud that our collaboration continues to move forward, and including this event today. So today, our conversation is a collaboration of several groups, not just Thunderbird and Global Chamber, but also the District Export Council of Arizona, which is affiliated with the U.S. Commercial Service. So our focus today will be on U.S. to China exporting, but that certainly does not exclude any type of exporting into China. You know, our goal today is not to, decide, trade policy or determine whether it's correct or incorrect. Our goal today is to look at what are some of the opportunities that are available in China, and what are some of the things that we can do to capture those in full reality of what the risks are, so that we can make the right decisions going forward for our business. China is 1.4 billion people, and they are the #1 largest country in the world, just ahead of India. They also have a GDP of nearly $16 trillion. They're the #2 economy in the world. It's an economy that is on the move upward, and it's one that we should be fully aware of. I think if you could switch to the next slide, we'll go through the agenda. This is the title of our program, which is all about the Export Horizon program. Thankfully sponsored by our partner, Thunderbird School of Global Management. We have an important agenda with really experts from around the world that, including in China and on the ground in China today, that are going to give us ideas and thoughts, and hopefully you as an exporter or you as an international business will be able to take away. The next slide is a brief review of me, Doug Brunke. Despite what it says there, I think the most thing that I'm proud of is my amazing daughter, who's in California, who's a nurse practitioner, and just so proud. Any of us as a parent, I think, can recognize that, our children are #1. And then if we're able to have a business and be part of an exciting thing like Global Chamber, we also find that to be a little bit of a child ourselves, and also something that we're proud of. So I'm very thankful that Global Chamber is a partner for each of these other groups today, and look forward to hearing more about what they have to say and our speakers. The next slide is the most important slide because it now brings us to the program. Mel Sanderson is an extraordinary leader, a global leader. And she is president of Mel Sanderson Consulting, but she's more than that. She's also the board member of Western Rare Earths, and I'm also very proud to say that she's on the advisory board for Global Chamber, and not just on the global advisory board, but she's helping us lead us into the future. And so, Mel, we really appreciate that. She is an ethical, sustainable growth advisor and advocate. She focuses in on a business that is sustainable. She has a focus on women in leadership, and she is definitely a member of the global tribe. She's been in the Foreign Service 20+ years. If you ever need to know somebody in the DRC in Africa, go to Mel. And it turns out she also knows pretty much anybody around the world. She's a very amazing global leader, and we're really proud to have her as the moderator today. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Mel Sanderson, without further ado, please go ahead. We look forward to hearing more about the program and learning today how we can grow in China.
Thank you so much, Doug. I have to say that there are very few people in all of Arizona who could stand in for Sanjeev Kagram, but you as our leading internationalist certainly fill the bill. And thank you for your kind introduction. It's good to have you as a friend. So, as Doug said, today's program, we're going to try to take you a little bit off the beaten path. I mean, everyone has heard so much about China in the news. It seems like there's an incessant drumbeat involving sanctions and trade disputes and mutual accusations, just flaming arrows being sent over the walls of trade. So we're going to try to meander down a different track today and talk about possibilities and relationships and new opportunities, because even when there's times of tension, that doesn't mean that there aren't still opportunities. So we want to explore the complexity of China, and we want to kind of point you towards some of those opportunities off the beaten path. I'm really pleased to be able to very briefly introduce you to our panelists today. Their fuller bios will appear on the screen as I bring them to your attention. So first up, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Min Chen. He is a professor of practice at Thunderbird School of Global Management. And he is also, I will say, quite a night owl. He's done us the great honor of joining us today from Shanghai, where he resides. Our next speaker will be Doug Guthrie, a professor, our next introducing person will be Catherine Reed. Thank you. Thank goodness the slides are right when the moderator is wrong. She is a leader of international sales and marketing. She has a consultancy in that area and he has over 18 years of experience in China. Now, next up is Professor Doug Guthrie, and he is the professor of global leadership at Thunderbird and also the executive director of China initiatives for Thunderbird. One interesting thing about him is that you see it on the screen. He also worked with Apple University in China. And then last but far from least, we come to Stephen Green, who is the Deputy Senior Commercial Officer at our U.S. Embassy in Beijing, China, and he is joining us from Beijing. So we have two night owls joining us today. And aside from his current posting in Beijing, he has served in other locations around the country and is what we in the Foreign Service would call a China hand, meaning a man who has deep specialization in a country or a region. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you, the audience, to this discussion with our experts. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A boxes as we go along. So please go ahead and start tossing out your questions and your thoughts as we continue our discussion. The mode of operation today will involve my asking each of our panelists an introductory question to set the stage for the conversation to follow. So today's first question will go to Doug. The lottery wheel has spun and Doug's the loser. He gets to go first. So Doug, my question for you is, you know, people have a tendency to refer, for instance, to Africa as a trade destination as if it's a country, when it's a whole entire continent to itself. And that makes it really hard and sometimes impossible to distinguish the differences, which sometimes are profound, that exist between those countries. People do the same thing to China. They refer to China as if it's a homogeneous entity, and that's so not true. China's opportunities are just as vast and diverse as its territory is, and its culture, likewise, is equally rich and diverse. So today we want to explore some of that diversity in terms of China's so-called second or third tier cities and regions. So not the Shanghais and not the Beijings of China. Less known, but potentially no less interesting. So Doug, perhaps in kicking us off, you could identify some of these opportune places and define some of those opportunities and maybe challenges that U.S. exporters might find there. Keep in mind you have 5 minutes.
I got you. And thank you, Mel. And keeping in mind I have 5 minutes, I'm even going to use a little tiny bit of my front time to just address one thing as the tee off or the kickoff for what you just said. And this is a tense moment. This feels tense to everybody. We've gone through a lot of tensions, particularly over the last 4 years. One of the things that I like to emphasize to executives and others that I talk to about these issues, there is tension right now, but there's also immense opportunity. And you can see the two administrations, the Xi Jinping administration and the Biden administration, playing an interesting sort of chess game. So on the one hand, you have the Secretary of State and the Alaska Accords and things seem tense. And then on the other hand, you have President Biden sending John Kerry over. And this was something that went very noticed in China because it was a high level administrative moment. And many people in China, Dr. Chen can maybe confirm this, but many of the netizens that I follow in China were very taken by the fact that somebody of John Kerry's stature came over, talked about climate, talked about collaboration over climate. And then President Xi went to President Biden's virtual meeting. And so we're seeing like these tensions, but we're also seeing moments of collaboration. And that is going to lead to some of the sectors that I want to mention very quickly. But to get more directly to your question now, to your point, I have conversations with executives all the time in which everybody knows the language of Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, the famous places of China. And particularly for those that are less experienced in China and you ask them what's their China strategy, they'll say, well, got to set up a rep office in Shanghai. And that's going to be, and you start to ask questions like, well, do you know what's happening in the second, third, and fourth tier cities? And by the way, this language of tiered cities in China is very common, right? Because it's an organizational structure that the central government has set in place. And, there's a whole system for how we think about these. But the important thing is that second, third, and in particular, third and fourth tier cities are the engine of growth in China today. This is where the vast majority of the population lives. These cities are much less crowded with foreign investors than tier one cities are. And this is not just where the consumption-based opportunity is, but it's where the real hunger for innovation is. And so let me just give you a couple of key examples. Let's talk about a place like Dongguan. A lot of people know Dongguan because it was an export-oriented city in Guangdong province and did very well in the light industrial goods. It has also become a place that is central to where industrial clusters are forming around much more complex manufacturing, like smart manufacturing, like electric car batteries. Similarly, recently, I was working with a company that was trying to figure out where they wanted to be, and they figured out that Nanchang was the best place for lithium batteries. Most people have never heard of Nanchang. It's actually a really interesting place historically because of the communist revolution. But the important thing for all of companies that I work with is to really think carefully about getting out of the very crowded first tier cities, particularly those on the coastal seaboard, and really think deeply about finding the right city with the right match of industrial clusters that fit with what your industrial interests are. And once you start to do that, you find the right place in terms of industrial location, but then, and I think all of my colleagues on this China panel will agree, the next step is really going deep with relationships in those local areas. Because one of the key things that most people miss about China, and Mel, you made this point, we often think of China as a monolith, or if it's not a monolith, it's got these 5-year plans that are coming out of Beijing and they tell everybody what to do, which is true, except the important thing also about China, it is a radically decentralized place. The success story of China is that it has gone through a transition from a planned economy to a market economy without rapid privatization, which is what happened in Russia and the former Soviet bloc. But what they've done is they've created autonomy for localized entrepreneurial governments to do whatever they need to do. Okay. And so like there's a really interesting model for how people sort of think carefully about what they do. Okay. So I see that I'm near the end of my time. And so, but I just want to push people to think China is not a monolith. It is a very decentralized place, and entrepreneurial governments have a tremendous amount of autonomy, but also responsibility for creating the economic development that they need. They are judged on KPIs just the way we write about this in my own world, where we call local governments as industrial firms. And all of these people are, these politicians, they are leaders of an industrial area that has the same type of things that they're measured by that any vice president of a major corporation would be. So Mel, let me turn it back there, and hopefully I hit my time.
Almost perfect. Not enough to get a demerit. And that was a great start to today's conversation. Thanks a lot, Doug. Dr. Chen, I want to give you the opportunity to follow up on Doug's commentary. I would say that, there's a perception among most of us here in the West that China's economic rise has been meteoric, but it's actually taken longer than a meteor, and that growth has not come without costs. Sometimes those internal costs have spilled over to create political rhetoric. Words do have power, but are not always convincing to we business people. So Dr. Chen, could you provide some insight into how Chinese businesses, and indeed Chinese citizens, in some of those markets that Doug just identified for us, may see Americans and American products these days? And given that dynamic, how best may exporters navigate these waters to successfully establish themselves in these new markets?
Well, it's a fairly big question for me. Let me just say a few words about myself first. I was a full-time professor before I returned to China in 1997. And ever since then, I've been involved in the manufacturing industry of China, in China. I was working for an American listed company with a diversified interest. What I've found in the past 3 decades is the improvement of manufacturing industries in China, tremendous improvement from almost a very poor manufacturing beginning to now fairly sophisticated in many industries. So China is actually the only country right now with a full range of industries, almost full complete supply chain within one country. If you want me to think about how the Chinese think about American products or American industries, I give you a couple of examples to show how the American industries facing the Chinese market. One is Apple. In China still, even though the Chinese are more patriotic nowadays than before with regard to the products they buy, many Chinese are encouraged to buy Huawei cell phones, but still Apple is very dynamic in the Chinese market. Still people want to use Apple to show, how successful they are in their daily working lives. And the other interesting example is GM. GM, I don't think has been doing very well in many markets, but in China, GM's joint venture is fairly successful. They're actually still competing with most successful group, the German car OEMs. Other successful stories is related more cultural oriented or agricultural products. In China, Disneyland is fairly successful in creating the kind of image among the Chinese consumers. Disneyland is not so far away from where I live right now. But I can, I can tell that even though we have the concerns about the pandemic in China, but Disneyland is still a place where many Chinese want to go. For agricultural products, everybody knows China is the biggest consumer of agricultural products in the world now, and America is the biggest supplier of the agricultural products. I think that's what I can say about your questions. I'm not so well prepared, but my
That's not a problem at all. Our conversation will circle back to
Okay.
some of those points that you've just raised. So thank you very much, Dr. Chen. So Catherine, I'd like to turn to you now. And you are a woman after my own heart in the sense that you too believe passionately in the power of relationships and that relationships are key to success in any country, and that would include China. But sometimes I think that probably we both have found that language and culture can occasionally create impediments between people. Now, in the biggest cities, there's usually a whole plethora of resources available to an exporter to help overcome these sorts of issues. But often this is less true in smaller places. And particularly when political tensions rise, business can become complicated. So my question for you is, with your experience in China, can you provide some insights on relationship building in a complex and rich culture such as theirs? And what resources can you recommend to help U.S. companies doing business off the beaten path?
Thanks for the question, Mel. That's really an interesting one, really after my own heart. I was really happy when I saw that was going to be my question. So I would say that almost everybody, when you start to talk about China, has heard about this concept of guanxi, or building relationships. And I think that many people in the West, they assume that this is something a little bit sleazy, and they kind of associate it sometimes with corruption, and they forget that actually it's just about taking the time upfront to build the relationships with people. And I personally made the experience in the past that a lot of Westerners, Europeans, but also Americans, they come into China and they have maybe just a few days for a visit. And so they want to get straight down to business. They want to immediately start talking about the meat of it. When in actual fact, what they need to do if they're going to build a good relationship with people is to sit down, spend an hour, maybe two, drinking tea, and then you can start to do business. And after that, the business will start to go much faster. And I think that you have to always remember, especially in China, that you need to invest in the relationship up front, which is maybe not quite so typical for US companies to do. And that from that point, you can build on your relationship. It might not be good for your waistline. It won't be good for your liver. It won't be good for your levels of sleep. And you'll probably embarrass yourself horribly at karaoke. But it will be good for business if you can do this in a genuine way by being genuinely interested in people. And I think that although in tier 1 cities, there are many people, many startups, especially tech startups, who would be willing to get almost straight down to business, at the end of the day, the strength of that relationship, if something starts to go wrong, and everybody has a honeymoon period in this business relationship, but as soon as things start to go wrong, if you haven't built that relationship, even in tier 1 cities, you will have a problem. So actually, with the last corporate business that I took into China in my employed position, it was in infant formula. We started with a policy of launching in tier 2. And actually, my very first presentation to a bunch of Chinese shop owners as the representative of the office was in Wuhan in 2011 on the 3rd of January. And it was a very steep learning curve at that time, because it was completely different China to the one it is now. And so I would say, as soon as you get into those lower tier cities, you have to really leave your assumptions at the door, as with most countries. So you need to on the one hand, expect that they have this hugely modern system of wanting to pay for everything with their phones, and they want to buy everything online or lots of things online. But on the other hand, the people who are in tier 2 to 4, they have a little bit more time than people would have if they're in the tier 1 cities, because they don't have such long commutes, long, but not so long. They maybe have a little bit more headspace, let's say, to be able to meet with you and to spend time with you, and they're interested and they like to meet people from outside. So if you can spend the time, and if you can find potentially somebody who can act as a bridge for you, and I think there are lots of people who can either provide this service, or you can find enough companies who have good English speaking people. People are interested to learn about the West, as long as you are also interested to learn about them. And I think that that is really a key to building relationships almost in any country that you go to. So that would be my top tips.
Excellent, thank you. You so far win the prize for the best use of time, coming in under budget. So Stephen, there's your challenge. As we turn to you, and I am about to pose you your question, in which the preface to the question is that even in the face of sanctions and heightened tensions, trade continues, as I mentioned earlier. And almost everyone, I think, listening in on this call knows already that one of the most vital organizations in ensuring that continuity of opportunity is the U.S. Commercial Service. And so I would like you today, as American exporters' best friend, to give us some examples of the kinds of services that commerce offers in China, and specifically in these secondary markets, and also bring out your view on what kinds of opportunities exporters might find there.
Oh, thanks, Mel. And I want to thank the partners that organized the webinar for the opportunity to meet with these great U.S. companies that took time to log in today and hear us out. I think I might take the second part of your question first to set the framework for the first part of the question. We've talked about tensions on the call, and tensions will remain. That's just going to be a reality as two powers, one that's been around for a while and the other that's not new on the block, but is rising quickly, and has, as Doug mentioned, become the second largest economic engine in the world. And I think those tensions will bridge the two administrations, the outgoing Trump administration and the now seated Biden administration. But I also think there's palpable reasons to be optimistic that we're going to perhaps take a new course with China, or slightly different course with China. The reason I'm optimistic, and Doug mentioned several of these reasons, is we had some really good meetings in Anchorage on March 18th with Secretary of State Blinken and his counterparts from the Chinese government, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi. And Secretary Blinken said we were able to have a very candid conversation over an expansive agenda, and on the issues of Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, and climate change, our interests intersect. And so that gives me a lot of optimism in the climate change space, environmental technologies, and other ancillary sectors like green transportation, greening up supply chains. This is going to be with us, and I think it's going to stick between US and China. And as the largest emitters in the world, how can we work together and bring in private sector expertise and investment to meet those ambitious goals? What Secretary Blinken said on economics, trade, and technology is that the US government is reviewing these issues in close consultation with Congress, along with our allies and partners. And that review, top to bottom, the that the White House is leading. Review of former policies and things that are in place is underway and so far not conclusive. And so we're waiting even here in China for guidance on where are those areas where we can take a new course with China. But I'm quite certain that climate change and everything related to it is going to be front and center in that. Secretary Blinken also said the US's relationship with China will be competitive where it should be. He said it'll be collaborative where it can be, and it's going to be adversarial where it must be. And so he's kind of laid out 3 pathways of how this relationship is going to develop. And I think the one we're interested in are the first two, competitive and collaborative at the US Department of Commerce. And then Doug also mentioned Secretary Kerry's very successful meetings in Shanghai on April 17th, all about climate change, our special envoy for climate change with his counterparts from the Ministry of Environment. And then finally, President Biden's Leader Summit on Climate Change that he convened on April 22nd, where President Xi Jinping insisted in a good way on being the second speaker. And my understanding is we granted the Chinese leader that opportunity to show how important this is for the world. So I'm really optimistic with all that happening. Out of the Shanghai meeting with Secretary Kerry, we had the first joint statement between the United States and China in like 5 years, okay? So that's a big deal, and you can find that online, and it's got a lot of guidance, I would say, or tips on what's coming. Very specific, even though it's just a 6-page document that came out of those 3 or 4 days of meetings on climate change. And then I loved Catherine's description of the difference between the first tier. I would say there's 3 things about the second and third tier where I spent some time. It's very accessible. They love meeting foreigners. They don't get as much attention as Beijing, Shanghai, and the other Guangzhou, the other big cities. And the opportunities there are relatively untapped. So accessible and opportunities to discover. Second thing I would say about the second and third tier is it's not easy. It's a tough go of it for an American company sitting there in Tucson to try to be doing business in Anshan, Liaoning province, where I worked for a couple years. There's virtually no English to be had in that type of environment. Oftentimes it'll be a pretty Byzantine bureaucracy driven wholly by the government, and very complex web of how to decipher where and how to move forward with those opportunities. And then I would say the third thing is partnering is absolutely imperative. You must have a reliable and experienced partner to really crack this nut. And I want to give a shout out to the people who can help with that. My colleagues in Arizona, Leandro Solosano, the Phoenix USIAC director, is here with us this morning. Ruth Soberanis in the Phoenix USIAC is here with us this morning, and Christina Parisi in the Tucson USIAC. Those are U.S. Export Assistance Centers waiting to help you connect with us to deliver on our client services, which we can get into more specifically if there's interest in that, Mel. So thanks so much.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Stephen. I want to just, in launching into our conversational phase, because we have some questions coming in already, but I want to just touch on some of these themes that Stephen just brought up. And no, my cat is not Chinese, although you might think she is, the way she continues to insist on being party to the conversation. When we look at some of the markets, and specifically, Doug, the cities that you sort of delineated for the group, and this is for the entire group, so at this point we're in a conversation, so everyone jump in as you wish. What are the sorts specifically of major enterprises that are operating in those markets? And what are the opportunities that there might be for Americans to contribute to that particular economic segment? Don't be scared.
So I'm happy to jump in and start the conversation, but I think all of the panelists know just as much as I do about this. But the one thing I would say that is a general answer to your question, Mel, is that local governments, they have to think very strategically about how they're developing their areas, right? And so like, they don't just sort of randomly throw the doors open. So I saw in the chat, somebody asked about healthcare and biotech. Recently, I've been working with a medical devices company that it wants to, partner with a Chinese company. We did some research, and it turns out like, it's a first-tier city, but in Shenzhen, there is a major cluster of medical device industry. And so if you go to the places where the industrial clusters are, you are inevitably going to find the things that both Catherine and Steve and Professor Chen also mentioned, which is you're going to find the right partners. You're also going to find the right local governments that think about these things. And then you're going to kind of go deep in these relationships, and you're going to be a part of that industrial cluster. Probably the most famous industrial cluster in recent years was, Zhengzhou moved from being a low second-tier city to being a high second-tier to now first-tier city because of their attraction of Foxconn to really help them in sort of building an entire high-tech zone. And there are examples like this all over the country, and there are different types of areas. Some are more general. So the Suzhou Industrial Park pretty much has just blown up and has everything. Hangzhou is really the Silicon Valley and has high tech. But so many of the second and third tier cities have really figured out what these different areas are. And so it's hard to give a very specific answer because there are 633 tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And so like it's all over the place. But I think to Catherine and Steve's point, finding the right place and finding the right partnerships and then building the relationships with the right government officials, that's how you kind of take off in this space. So I'll just stop there and leave it to my colleagues to answer.
Well, I think they seem happy with your response, Doug. So let me, actually, I want to follow up. You brought up the sort of high-tech aspects, and there's a question from our audience, Dr. Chen, specifically for you. And it comes back to what you were saying about Apple products and the Chinese interest in those, which may be partly social. But the question is, are these sorts of products being sought, i.e. the high-end technology products? And what are the barriers to import these products, particularly in the areas of biotech or nanotechnology?
I'm not so familiar with the barriers to export to China.
Steve may be able to jump in on that one too, but
yeah,
please continue.
Maybe Steve, better than me with regard to special barriers. But I was involved in the medical industry in China. One of the biggest challenges for foreign companies to export to China is to pass the standard FDA. And in the process of applying for the licenses, you have to be heavily involved in the relationship building and also go through all the bureaucratic procedures. That delayed export efforts of many foreign companies to the medical industries in China. Normally it's take about 2 to 3 years or even more than that. But that's what I can remember. But for high-tech products, average high-tech products, I don't see any special barriers to export to China. Maybe Steve, you know more better than me.
Well, that gets to the realities of where we're at in the bilateral relationship and the the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has been very active, stealing the headlines over the last couple of years, particularly since I got back to China in March of 2019. And then immediately, almost immediately, Huawei, China's national champion in the ICT telecommunications space, was put on the entity list, which in the simplest terms means US companies cannot sell stuff legally under US law to Huawei. And we have really expanded the use of the entity list mechanism, certainly beyond anything I've seen in my 20 years with the Commerce Department. I don't know much about pre-2000 how we use the entity list, but since I joined the last 2 years, we have used that more actively than ever in my career. And it's now getting into things like military buildup in the South China Sea, human rights in places like Xinjiang province, where we are essentially cutting off large swaths of the Chinese economy from any sort of opportunity to do business in a transparent and legal way without some sort of license or exception. But the presumption of a license application is denial. So it's like the spin cycle we're in. So I would say, especially in the tech sector, that is the biggest barrier that comes from our side. Huawei wants our stuff. We don't want to sell Huawei our stuff. That's a simple way of thinking about it.
Sure. And Doug, I want to toss that over to you, keeping in mind your experience with Apple, and see what you have to say in this regard. And of course, it touches also on the problem, or if the problem is real, of IP protection.
Yeah.
So you want to contribute in that area?
Sure. And, you know, I basically agree with everything that's been said so far, but I'll just give a tiny bit of nuance to the complexities of this. So it's very clear and concise and simple for the United States to put Huawei on a blacklist. And that includes even, like, you know, blacklisting apps that come from the company for the Google App Store. And there's all of those things have happened. And this is not new, by the way. I mean, the United States has been doing this with Huawei in particular, but Huawei is an example of a number of other companies since, as Steve mentioned, since the 2000s. The thing that I observed when I was working as an executive for Apple that's interesting is for companies that are American companies. So I don't think anyone would disagree that Apple's an American company, but Apple also has Chinese entities. And when Apple products are sold, so just to go to Professor Chen's example, when we're talking about products being sold within China, those Apple products that are made in China and are sold in China are not actually exports from China, from the US to China. They're Chinese products. I mean, they're American products, but they don't go through the same issues in terms of tariffs and in terms of export issues. Now, why is that important? It's important because Apple's entities in China have close relationships throughout the supply chain. And Steve will remember this, like back in the 90s, we used to think about technology transfer and joint ventures and technology transfer schedules, and it was all very clear. That was before China entered the WTO. After China entered the WTO in 2001, it became much more difficult for China to have a quid pro quo for market access, meaning they couldn't sit a company down and say, here's what you're going to do. You're going to have a joint venture with this company and you're going to transfer this technology. And so that opened the floodgates for companies in the electronic sectors, for example, to just come into China and to be able to set up ventures without using the supply chain, but without transferring technology. However, in today's China, this is why this current era is so important. When the current administration came to power, they were not liking that anymore. The idea of China just being open for business and foreign companies not giving something back was no longer okay, but they were under a WTO regime. And so there was a whole new spate of laws, the dispatch labor law, the cybersecurity law, which basically signaled to companies, it's going to be very difficult for you to do business here unless you make it clear that you're helping us, right? And helping us is Steve, you can confirm or disagree, but like helping us is a very vague term, but everybody knows what it means. And so it means like, if you're not setting up R&D centers, if you're not helping our suppliers get better in terms of their supply chain management, if you're not helping use the technology that comes from smart manufacturing from the United States to China, you're going to have a hard time. And I'll just give you one concrete example that's not an Apple example, but it's related. In 2015, probably it was, Steve, Samsung decided to move one of their final assembly plants to South Korea. And the Chinese government is very good right now at using lots of mechanisms for influencing market views. And Catherine, you would know about this as well as I do because you study consumers. But in 2016, Samsung's sales just tanked. And everybody wondered why. And it was because of a little thing that in Chinese, we call them suijun. That literally means water warriors, but they're basically people who work for the government, but are on social networks, and they can influence what products are liked and bought and sold. And so just to answer the question, it's a very complex world right now. And the Chinese government can put its thumb on the scale in lots of different ways that are still legal in terms of the WTO, but they put a lot of pressure on companies and they're very active. And so therefore, that means that, if you're not there helping the Chinese government, even if it's in subtle ways of technology transfer, you're gonna have problems. And so it puts a tremendous amount of pressure. And let me stop there because I think Stephen and Catherine can, jump in and either agree or disagree, but I think this is a really important dynamic.
Catherine, go for it.
Yeah, I agree with Doug. I mean, I think it's on the one hand, China is a free market economy. On the other hand, it's a market economy that can be controlled, both by the government or also by certain other big companies or interests who have the power to control enough netizens who can push things out there. And certainly in 2015, 2016, I was just about to sign some kind of South Korean influencer for my brand to do a lot of stuff for us. And suddenly South Korea there was all this thing about missile shields and, South Korea, they're evil over there. And so all of a sudden there was no way that we could use a South Korean influencer to represent our brand because it was just too risky. So I think that these kind of things, they often have a kind of chain reaction that maybe you wouldn't think of, because in the US or in Europe, it wouldn't have necessarily the same it wouldn't set in train the same set of reactions across the board. And companies shouldn't underestimate that if they're going into the market. Yeah.
Steve or Dr. Chen, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Maybe two things. One, China has been holding tight its plan for what they refer to, I guess the loose translation is the unverifiable list. And there are US companies that we would predict and they would expect to be the first to go on that unverifiable list once it's announced. And so this is an interesting play on the Chinese side. They have, since all the way back to 2 years ago with Huawei and then trade tensions escalating, they have not officially published that unverifiable list that they have more than quietly threatened to do. And so that, I think, is a mechanism that they use, adding to the toolkit that Doug described, where they just have you on pins and needles. That are you going to be the first or first five, the tranche? Or if you misstep in this month, are you going to be added to whatever that list looks like, which we have not seen. And so that's sort of a reality. And then just the, I talk to Americans here, maybe they're working for AmCham or whatever, and they're all in on China. They've been here 20 years. They have kids that are more Chinese than American. born and raised in second and third tier parts of China. And as you're speaking to them, they will, at times, if they feel like something they would share with the US government would be sort of crosswinds, they will literally apologize to the ceiling where the listening devices are, and then give you a lukewarm analysis of what they really think about what's happening here. And so that's just the way it works here.
Good Lord, I lived that life in Russia too, where everybody knew that the bugs were planted in the radiators in your apartment. So, you know, you would stand close to the radiator when you wanted to be heard, and you would slink away from it when you were hoping not to be heard. I know that world very well.
Your iPhone, that you carry everywhere. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's the biggest listening device in the world. Many companies, as a matter of fact, including at Freeport McMoran, where I retired from last year, he had a policy that you didn't take your company or your personal phone with you to China. When you landed on the ground, the company gave you a phone that was to be used by you in China with a list of things that you were not to be talking about if you called back to headquarters.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of companies are very aware of the surveillance mechanisms. I want to switch. We have a question that's kind of interesting. I want to switch to demographics, sort of the devil that's driving a lot of countries right now, ours, Europeans, Japan, and China as well. So the question is, you know, given the recent announcement that China now will permit 3 children instead of just 2, and also in raising the retirement age, implicitly acknowledging that, you know, worker replacement ratios are not up to snuff. The question becomes, is there an opportunity in these demographic changes for US companies that are in the services sector and catering to those markets? And Catherine, I want to start with you because you made reference at the beginning of our conversation to your last corporate position with a infant food company. So I expect you might know something about these areas.
Yep. It's been a hot topic the last couple of days on social media. I've seen with third child policy and so on. I think third child policy, 2020, China had the lowest birth rate in, I don't know, probably ever, for a variety of reasons. Partly because it's the natural development when a country becomes more well-to-do, that people have less kids because they're not relying on children as their source of old age insurance, let's say. But this has been a trend. Having children in China is just incredibly expensive. The whole education, the whole food issue, I think these are just unbelievable. I mean, compared to Europe, I'm not sure about what the actual prices are for infant formula in the US, but compared to Europe, the price on the shelf of regularly imported formula is between 3 and 4 times higher in China than it is in Europe regularly. And the same goes for a lot of other baby products. So for sure, there's certainly opportunities in the market, especially in the premium sector. The market is going in this premium direction, so it's still growing. Even though the birth rate is not growing, and I don't anticipate that the third child policy is going to make a huge difference to that, because those people who can afford a third child, they have one already. And a 2-child policy also didn't really make a lasting effect on that. So unless the government can really bring in other changes to level out the playing field in terms of education costs, food costs, all of the other things, diaper costs, all of those kind of costs that go into raising a child, this is not going to make a difference. Young families, they want to have their little Kaiser who's going to be spoiled to death by, 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and
older sisters, etc.
A lot of them, you know, the parents are also only children. So it's literally 6 adults funneling all of their income into one child. It's yeah.
As an only child myself, I can tell you from personal experience, it's a great life.
Yeah. But I think also certainly Silver Surfer generation, this is going to be also quite interesting. But I'm not too sure about exactly how far they're raising the retirement age. But I know that, you know, a lot of my friends, they sit and they say, oh, you know, you're quite close to retirement. And I kind of look at it and I'm like, no. And she says, oh, my mom retired at 52, 53. And I'm thinking, whoa, no.
Must be nice.
So raising the retirement age is maybe quite a, you know, this is a relative term, I think, in China to some extent. Yeah. Steve, you wanted to take that over?
It looked like both Doug and Steve might have been leaning forward. Steve?
Okay. I'll just jump in and add a couple really quick thoughts on some of the things that Catherine just raised. One of the things that is really interesting about this, so the demographics are clear. And as Catherine mentioned, industrializing economies, they all go through this. Japan went through this, Western European countries went through this. Like it is a phenomenon. Now, of course, this was exacerbated by the one-child policy in China, and I think they completely were late to the game in figuring out how big the demographic bubble was going to be. And so, you know, and so they changed the law in 2015. And to Catherine's point, what they didn't account for was actually by 25 years into or 35 years into the one-child policy, a different culture had set in place. People didn't, you know, all of the young urban elite in first tier and second tier cities that I know, they don't want to have 2 kids. Like it's more expensive, and like they're saving money for their kids' education, and healthcare systems are getting set up better. And so it's just that, and so the country's clearly in a difficult spot right now. And the 3-child policy, you know, I'm not optimistic that it's going to change much. The one thing I also want to mention, though, to Catherine's point, so there are 2 other things that are really important here. One is China's transition from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. So this is part of what they call the double circulation system. This is really important to avoid what economists call the dual income trap. And they're worried, not only are they not going to have enough people to do the work, but also they're not going to have enough people to consume the goods that they want to create for internal consumption. And that's a big thing. The second thing that's really interesting here is there has been a big divide between the urban elite and the rural world. So like if you were a farmer and you knew you needed hands to work the land, you would just sort of go ahead and have 2, 3, 4 kids anyway because you needed it. Now, as agricultural production becomes more automated, you have less need for that. And the interesting knock-on effect that I haven't seen many people write about yet, but this is what I think the Chinese government's really scared about, is, you know, part of Chinese manufacturing prowess relies on the floating population, which is a population of 300 million people that move around the country as a migrant labor force. And a lot of those people are people who were born to families that didn't need them as farmhands. And so they just move around the country and they work at places like Foxconn and all of the suppliers across China. If that population continues to diminish, not only is this going to affect China's replacement age in just the overall manufacturing economy, it's going to replace one of the key pillars of the power of the manufacturing supply chain. And that to me, it strikes me that must be another thing that they're scared about, but they're not talking about it fully yet. I don't know, Steve, does that make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense. And one of the growth areas and opportunities that we've been exploring for several years, although there's some reasons why it's not quite right for US service providers and other segments of our economy is the aging population. So on the other end, you know, China soon will have a crisis, basically, of what to do with all of their senior citizens. the new generation doesn't necessarily buy into the 3, possibly 4 generations under one roof. So they're looking for alternatives, just as we do in the United States for their grandparents or their elderly parents. And so that combined with the everything that Catherine and Doug just described, I'm trying to get my head around what all that means exactly, but I think it means there's opportunities on both ends of that spectrum, and we're gonna try to figure that out, how U.S. companies can take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Wanted to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I was going to say everything that I've seen in the last few months would say, as long as you're in a premium, I mean, for US companies, there's no point to try to compete in China on cheap products, because that's just not going to work. Even though actually in a lot of fields, China is now in manufacturing just too expensive to be competitive on the world stage. And that manufacturing is moving across to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and so on. But there are certainly opportunities in mom and baby products on the premium field. There are opportunities in the healthcare sector, especially after 2020. Anything to do with, for example, supplements, or anything to do with maintaining fitness. I mean, the Chinese traditionally have not been especially sporty, but I think a lot of people kind of discovered the joys of doing a little bit more exercise during last year and trying not to go crazy stuck in apartments, small apartments. And of course, any products which are really aimed at the older generation and enhancing their quality of life, this kind of products have certainly got huge potential. And you shouldn't underestimate the potential on this. To bring it back, you shouldn't underestimate the potential and the reach down into the lower tier cities, because especially if you have any kind of products that you can advertise in any way online, then of course you can reach any part of China.
Dr. Chen, do you have something you'd like to add in this regard?
Well, thinking about 3 kids is extremely difficult for the younger generation of China. One of the problems is that the estimate of raising a kid is about 1.5 million to 2 million RMB. That's a tremendous burden for the younger generation, especially the generation who has been raised as a single kid. They have so many burdens to take care of their parents at the same time to have the baby. So the burden is too much for them, unless the government has to will provide some special measures, like say, for example, half of the housing price in the big cities of China. They have to, will provide tremendous subsidies for young people to buy apartments in the big cities. And also they have to provide subsidies to education and children care sort of things. But in China's manufacturing industry, the number one challenge for almost all the companies in China is to find workers. We have recently, you see a lot of news on the employers standing along the street to wait for employees to pick them up. Not like in the past, the employees are waiting for employers to pick them up. Nowadays, the whole thing has changed. In almost all the industries, you have to have special measures to recruit people and also keep them. Because if you don't have better packages, and then your employees, especially skilled employees, will go to another company. The turnaround rate is very, very high in China right now. So I would think with the gone of the population bonus, many Chinese manufacturers really have to think about how to move out of the country to produce part of their products overseas to solve these problems. But they don't know how can they do that. They don't have experiences. They're not familiar with the most of the Chinese companies have been very successful with the comparative advantages, not competitive advantages. So when they go out of the country, they lose their comparative advantages. That's what maybe we can help them to do business in other countries.
Nice.
That is a very interesting perspective. So I want to pose a question. It sounds as though there's opportunities for, let's say, gymnastic franchises from the US to maybe come into the Chinese market, maybe nursing home franchises coming into the market as well. So I have two questions. One, how difficult is it to engage in franchising in China? And two, one other solution, it seems to me, other than leaving China, would be to turn to automation. So is the worker shortage and these other demographic issues that we're discussing likely to lead to faster and broader automation in Chinese manufacturing, which also could be an opportunity for US exporters?
That has been a topic very popular among the Chinese manufacturers to how to automate their production process. But not all the companies can do that. They in the labor-intensive industries, it's more expensive to automate your production processes. Those companies which can, they have made tremendous investment in automating their manufacturing processes, but not all the companies can do that. With regard to franchising, that's not a new concept in China anymore. So I think that's possible in China to do that. Fitness center in China now is becoming more and more popular, and if you have a good franchising program, you could do that in China.
Now that's good to hear. There's a concrete opportunity that would benefit China by making the population healthier and benefit a US exporter as well. So win-win. Gotta love that scenario.
Could I add
Doug?
one thing, Mel, to just what Professor Chen just said? I don't know anything about franchising, so I can't speak to that. But the thing about smart manufacturing is a very interesting opportunity. So just, Min Chen, you'll remember this, but just a couple of months ago, maybe 2 months ago, the czar, who's the sort of head of manufacturing and does all the analyses for manufacturing, came out with a report. And the Chinese netizens went crazy because he said China is still 30 years behind the US in smart manufacturing, which was shocking to a lot of people because, if you've worked with companies like Apple or Tesla or others that, you sort of think like China's supply chain is very sophisticated. But in some ways, the State Council was putting forward a pessimistic, but also they were really trying to push China to say, don't get complacent. We're not so great yet. We still have a lot of work to do with automation and smart manufacturing. And to your point, Mel, this is, I think, a really interesting opportunity for US companies. And it's what I saw Apple doing. A part of Apple's hold in China is because they really made clear that they were helping the manufacturing supply chain and helping their suppliers figure out smart manufacturing. And so there is an interesting link there that's not just about products and access to market, but it's sort of about partnership. And I think everybody on this panel has mentioned how important partnership is in China. And so I think Professor Chen's point on this is right on target. I think it's a really interesting thought.
We have a really specific question from the audience, which I'm going to start with you on this one, Stephen. But again, anyone who has a thought about this, the question is, one of our members, his company is in the process of applying for the first American-owned insurance license in China. And his question is, how good do you think our chance is at getting approved?
Yeah, China's come a long way in liberalizing the insurance sector very recently, as recently as this year. And I do think there are opportunities. We're trying to follow it and better understand it in the midst of tensions where we're not meeting with our Chinese counterparts very often to be able to articulate the answer to that question. The optimistic side of me says yes, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. I think that's John Lee about.
Yes.
I have to admit, I'm not an expert on China's insurance sector, but we have experts on our team. And so we would love to connect you with our folks here and the Export Assistance Center there in Arizona and create a triangular discussion about that.
Awesome. I want to circle back, I guess, in a sense, to demographics. And Doug Brunke's probably going to be smiling and nodding his head. I'd like to talk for a second about the role of women in Chinese business. And of course, that goes back to policies around children, and in the bad old days of one child, the preference that tended to be for sons over daughters, and so a shortfall of women in business in general and cultural aspects. So I want to just briefly get some reactions about women in business. And Catherine, I saw you smile, so I'm going to hit you first.
Yeah, I think China has an interesting mix when it comes to women in business, because on the one hand, if I look at my friends, they are under tremendous pressure. If they're not married and with their one child by the time they're 30, then they have not just their mom on their back, but they have their grandma on their back, and they're being pushed that, the biological clock is ticking and you should be thinking about it. On the other hand, I've always been impressed in China, in the same way that I am every time I go to Turkey, actually, by the number of really strong businesswomen who are running businesses. And those women who are running businesses, they mostly have 2 kids as well. So they're running a business, they have 2 kids. They are, if their husband is probably also an only child, so they're taking also care of 2 sets of parents if they are maybe of an age where they're no longer 100% healthy. And so these are really, Chinese women are really strong women when it comes to business. And I would say a lot of the small shops, especially in lower tier cities, a lot of those businesses are run by women who've maybe gone away into Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou to study, come home to get married close to home, and then started a business with the knowledge that they've gained from working in maybe tier 1 for several years before they settled down, as it were. So I would say China is a pretty fairly equal opportunities market, because most companies, people go away for, if a mum has just, I think by law they can have up to 6 months maternity leave, but most of them are back after 4 months, if not earlier. So by European standards, we have 2 years in Austria, so this is like they're barely out of the hospital and they're already back in the office.
Yeah, that's just another great reason among many others that we should move to Austria. I love Vienna and the area around it. Gentlemen, any comment on the women in business issue?
Well, Chinese women certainly enjoy much more equality in comparison with the Korean, the Japanese, and many other Asian countries' ladies. That is related to Mao's period of policy that women are supposed to hold up half of the heaven. That's what the slogan Mao raised during his time. So I think I don't see any much of a difference between ladies and men in terms of the entrepreneurship. Depends on whether you're willing to do that or not. But you do have the same opportunities or even better opportunities sometimes. according to the comments from many men. They say the ladies nowadays have too much power.
Yeah, there's never too much power for we ladies. That's what I say.
And especially Shanghai ladies, they have this reputation, as far as I know, Shanghai ladies have this reputation of being extremely strong-willed and very to the point, very dominant ladies, strong ladies in Shanghai.
Yeah.
Dragon ladies. Dr. Chen, I want to continue with you for a second here. There's a interesting question. Because you were talking about some Chinese manufacturers looking to resettle abroad, due to the problems that you mentioned that we've been discussing. But it's really difficult, as we all know, for a Chinese company to invest directly in some ways in the United States. So the question from the audience is, would a Chinese company that needs to reestablish itself elsewhere be interested in getting into Mexico? Because of course, doing so then could open possibilities under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and also open the Latin American market for their products.
I actually personally been involved in setting up a small manufacturing company in Mexico. So I got some experiences in that. Many Chinese companies are interested in doing something in Mexico, but they're so scared about the news regarding drugs and the kidnapping and all the other crime-related issues. So they are interested, but many of them are still watching to see if they have some successes in Mexico. Our experience in Mexico is that not so much related to safety in Mexico. It's more related to different culture. Say, for example, in China, employees want to have overtime so that they actually get paid double or triple, depends on which day you work, what overtime you have. But in Mexico, overtime is not their top choice. So for many Chinese companies which are established in Mexico, they have good orders coming in. They have problems to motivate people to work extra hours, even though they give them higher pay. This is something they don't quite understand. So cultural differences actually is one of the barriers for Chinese companies going overseas too, not to speaking of the legal system difference.
Just to Eduardo, who asked that question, sounds to me like you should be in touch directly with Dr. Chen, since Dr. Chen has some experience in this regard. Okay. And sort of a related question that goes to Chinese investment. And this, again, for all of our panelists, could you comment on the future of capital investments by Chinese venture capitalist firms in US startups? Do you think that those sorts of VC investments will increase in coming years, or sort of they've capped out already?
I can try to weigh in on that a little bit. So one of the things that's interesting about the VC market in China is, of course, there are a lot of wealthy people, and there are a lot of people who are entrepreneurs who want to be angel investors, but the VC market isn't structured in the same way as it is in the United States. And that's partly because the two largest investors in companies in all of Asia are these little companies called Tencent and Alibaba. And so they in a sense, kind of control and even crowd out the VC market. Now, there's an interesting question that comes up based on Mario's question. Right now, as we've all seen in the news, the Chinese government is moving aggressively at regulating fintech, and these two companies are in the crosshairs. And so I can't answer for how that's going to shake out, but if I had to guess, my guess is that to Mario's question, yes, we're going to see this go up, because I think Tencent and Alibaba are going to need to protect themselves and kind of rein in a lot of their investments around the world. And then we're going to see a more furtive VC market emerge. That's just my guess, but I think that that's where the trend is going.
Interesting question that just popped up along these same lines. What about Jack Ma? And
He's still
implications of, is he still alive? Good, that's good to know. That's a big one right there. I mean, in a broader sense though, I mean, what are the implications for Chinese like Jack Ma from what's happening to him right now?
Well,
Talk about stifling enterprise.
China is now at a stage where politically the countries become more conservative, but economically, the country is still liberalizing in many ways. So you would see a contradictory trend in China. The problem with Jack Ma is that he talks too much about politics. Among many Chinese entrepreneurs, they know something is going to happen to him when he's so open in talking about politics where he's not supposed to be involved. So now, if you're involved heavily in politics, China is not a good place to go. But if your interest is only for business, I think there are still many opportunities in China. I don't think Jack Ma's incident represent a trend that will affect many entrepreneurs in China. But it does really show the limitation with regard to where you can go in politics. You know, basically, his worst comment that caused him problem is that he thought the Chinese banking system is not a real system. It doesn't really exist. So that challenged the whole bureaucracies. You know, the banking industry in China is still state-owned, basically dominated system. So you're challenging the whole bureaucracies in China. That was very difficult for many people to accept. But he's free man. So
Yes, you're absolutely right. And there are many countries that we can think of where he might not be. So that's very true. We're getting close to the wrap-up time, but I want to toss in a last question that's economic, but maybe also slightly political, which is for American companies doing business in Taiwan, are there any specific risk factors that they should be considering? And are we seeing any trends in that Taiwan relationship, either negative or positive, that could impact a U.S. company's China strategy?
Steve?
Yeah, echoing silence and grim smiles from all the panelists.
I didn't expect that question on the panel here, but happy to try to respond to it, having spent some time in Taiwan as well. I think it's hard to say. It's hard to predict where the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship is headed. I'm optimistic that the U.S. and Taiwan will continue their special relationship that they've had for 40 plus years through the American Institute in Taiwan, and that'll remain robust and strong, and it's an incredible two-way economic trading relationship that we have with Taiwan. It's a point of friction between the US and China, of course. They are constantly demarching us, calling us in and scolding us for the way we interact with Taiwan. But that's not going to change anytime soon. we see Taiwan as a very strategic partner in this region. There's talk of some sort of trade agreement between the United States and Taiwan. I don't know if that'll have enough legs to actually come to fruition in the foreseeable or not, but those discussions are happening. And you saw under the previous administration kind of an unprecedented number of high-level visits of US government officials coming to the island and meeting with Taiwan counterparts in a more official capacity than we've ever seen post 1979. So I don't have much more to say about that, Mel.
No, but thank you for tackling it, Stephen. Much appreciated. Okay, everybody, here's your chance, the 2-minute wrap up. So I'm going to come back to each one of you and give you 2 minutes to share your key recommendation for US exporters interested in doing business in China. I'm pausing for that suspenseful 10 seconds or so to give you a chance to unscramble your wits. And you know what? I think we're going to reverse our order from the morning. So Stephen, I'm going to start with you.
The thing that comes to mind is advice I got when I went into the Peace Corps. Love many, trust few, and always paddle your own canoe.
I like that one. Catherine?
I would say go into it with open eyes. Don't assume anything. Enjoy the journey. It's a bit of a crazy journey when you go into China, but it can be really good fun, and it can be also very lucrative. Have your global things, but also be prepared to localize much more than you would in most other markets. And especially with consumer products, you have good opportunities in China.
Awesome. Dr. Chen?
I am fundamentally a optimistic person. I think with regard to China development, we have a common saying in China is the growth always follow this pattern: 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. It depends on which cycle that you are in, but China will continue to grow, to evolve, and also to change, but always follow this logic: 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, not a straight line forward. But altogether, you see some hope ahead.
Be persistent.
Be
Gotcha.
persistent. Yeah.
Okay, Doug, so you had the first word, now you get the last word.
All right, I'm gonna try to be really quick. And so I love that people are using aphorisms and ways to think about things. One of the things that I love that Catherine touched on, Guanxi and relationships, and we've all talked about partnerships. The other thing that I love to raise always is Deng Xiaoping had a famous saying that was 莫是过河, which means feeling for stones to cross the river. And it means it's really about gradualism. It really means things are always emergent in China. There's not some standard economic model that everybody's driving for. And so when you have partners in China, just always build the relationships with those partners and feel for those stones and get into the next step of the river. I want to end on both a bit of a cryptic dour note, but an optimistic note. I'm happy that I defer to Steve on this because he's the expert in the room. I am much more pessimistic right now about certain things. But the good news about this being pessimistic at this particular moment is I remember back to the 1990s when I was a young assistant professor and got involved with the most favored nation debate and the permanent normal trade relations debate. And I really believed at the time that it was the collaboration between, like this panel, the collaboration between business people and academics and people in the government that I think we saved the relationship, because we made it clear that engagement had to be the policy. And I continue to believe that. And I just continue to believe that the work that the chamber is doing and the work you're doing, Mel and Catherine and Steve and everybody, like it just is important for us to continue having these dialogues because we have to be there. And we have to make this relationship work. And so as tense as things get or they seem, I love that this panel happened. So thank you, Doug, and everybody else for having it.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining today and sharing your experiences and your insights and your encouragements. Persistence and determination and relationships and courage are the keynotes that I've heard. And I think they certainly epitomize both America and China. So I too am optimistic that we will move forward to a better future through turbulent waters. Thank you, Doug Brunke, for joining us today to get us off on the right note. And thank you again to all three of our organizations for making this possible. And make sure to watch out for episode 3 of Export Horizons. Thanks and goodbye.
Thanks, Mel. Great job.